Hello, everyone watching either in the room or by recording. This is Dr. Alana James, and it's the 24th of April, 2017. This is a conversation requested by a student about ethical review and internal review boards. We like to start with quotes, and I'm going to put three together for this one. Albert Camus, the philosopher, said, "A man without ethics is a wild beast loosed upon the world." Jane Addams, the humanitarian, said, "Action indeed is the sole medium of expression for ethics." So we put those together and we'd say that it's important for us to have ethics, and it's important for us to have to take action. And we have a person in the room who isn't hearing. Adrian and Amanda, are you hearing well? Okay, so Salihu, why don't you try going out and or setting up another connection. Be sure to be on wire, not wireless. And the app seems to work well. Adrian, have I caught all the things that seem to work best? Thanks for helping. We'll see. We always hate it when someone in the room can't hear. Generally, it has to do with a bandwidth connection at one end or the other, or things not being wired. So we'll see what happens. And pardons for the people who are watching by recording as we take care of people in the room. One plausible explanation for these disagreements was the people recognized some common ethical norms. This is disagreements about whether or not a particular piece of research was considered ethical. Is that it's that people can disagree on whether something is ethical as they apply and balance them in different ways in light of their own values and life experiences. For example, two people might agree that murder is wrong, but disagree on the morality of abortion because they have different understandings of what it means. So what I'm trying to get to there is that it isn't as easy as whether if we do things a certain way or if we take actions in a certain way. It has some conversation to be had about what is ethical or not ethical. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about ethics in life, and then ethics in research, and then what constitutes unethical. And then that's a quick overview. And then we go into the practical. How are you going to use it, and how is it going to affect what you're actually doing? Salihu, glad that you got on and can hear, so thank you. All right, quick overview about ethics. Two kinds, deontological and utilitarian, are generally considered the main roots or branches of this conversation of ethics, and all of us stand somewhere on a continuum between them. So we might be deontological, which is very right, wrong, black or white on some issues, and we might be more utilitarian on other issues. Do we always tell the truth exactly as it's fine, point, black and white? Or sometimes might we tell the truth in such a way as to not hurt someone's feelings? Deontological said you always are just blunt. Utilitarian would say the outcome of the action is important, and therefore if someone's feelings were hurt, you might take a slightly different stance. That's a general way of thinking about those two varieties. So it's important for us to know where we stand, and neither one is right or wrong, although the deontological people probably feel that the utilitarian people are wrong sometimes. In fact, in the world of ethics and philosophy, both are considered to be perfectly legitimate ways to guide ourselves and our behavior through life. And so these are a way of life. They are not an event. So Adrian points out that how we deliver our ethical stance is important as well, because it's part of it. It's not just the words or just the belief. It's the tone. It's the ideology. It's the circumstances. It's a way of life, not a particular event. Then we carry this into research. So we have codes, of course, of scholarly conduct defined by each institution. I want to highlight that because even though you all will probably be taking some sort of course on ethics prior to your ethical review, and that course probably will have very similar material about some of the unethical research that has taken place, sometimes almost horrific research, that has been taken place at other times that caused the reason for scientific inquiry to require ethical review every time human subjects are involved. That still each institution has its own desires, its own things that it wants all of their students to do, and that would be slightly different than one institution to another. I'll give you an example. One of the major online universities requires of all of its doctoral students that their work has some kind of social impact. That therefore, the requirement for social impact definitely goes backwards into who are their human subjects and what kinds of questions they are asking. And so it's something that comes into their internal review board review more so than it would another university who didn't have that goal. All right, so certain universal ideas we would expect to be in most of your ethical reviews. How you treat human subjects, the honesty of your questions and the way the lid is set up, etc., throughout all of your document, how you're going to maintain integrity throughout your experiments and the research. That includes how you're going to maintain the records, how you're going to keep them safe. All of that's part of internal integrity. Publishing the results and records, how that may be done, or the fact that you wouldn't use a person's name in the publishing without their explicit consent is another ethical issue. Granting access to others that allow reproduction, which I found a very interesting one because a lot of doctoral students have difficulty tracking down the instrumentation from previous research so that they can use it too, and yet it is considered an ethical stance that we do give access to others who follow along after us to allow them to reproduce or test what we did in different circumstances. We have personal responsibility for our research. That's involved the way we conduct ourselves, the way we treat other people, etc., and how we acknowledge others. And I mean more than just the citations. The acknowledgement that you put into the beginning of your document, how you acknowledge the fact that ideas came from one of your subjects per chance, all of those are involved in this question of ethics. Question for the people in the room. Anything there surprising to you, or pretty much was it what you were expecting? Amanda said that was what she expected. I'll go with that. I was a little surprised by number 5. I didn't realize that that actually granting access to others was considered ethical. I mean, it makes sense, but I hadn't put it in that stance. So what constitutes unethical? Well, misconduct holds true whether or not the actions were deliberate or unconscious. Plagiarism, what's wrong with plagiarism? Well, it clutters, if nothing else, it's very unkind to the people who you're taking their work from. It sets you up where they weren't, all that kind of thing. But it also clutters our world. We have an awful lot of data in the world, and it clutters our world with misconceptions. Falsification and fabrication are the other two buckets, if you would, of what is considered unethical. Falsification affects everything that comes after it. And it is, of course, when you add a few extra points to some of your data so that it swings a little stronger the way you wanted it to. Fabrication is when you make up the data whole altogether. And obviously, it affects everything that comes after it too, because then it's based on a complete lie. Who is responsible? You are. And included in this unethical behavior are questions of whether or not you put out your journal articles to more than one place for submission at a time. It's another one I think is a little bit of a gray area for some researchers. And the fact that you might have, in a world where we have so much data and so much knowledge, something that could be considered unintentional plagiarism when we just forgot that we've worked with these ideas for so long, we forgot who was the first person to say them. And I'll add one more that I'll mention later. It's called salami slicing. And what it means is that you have a big study and you slice it up into little bits, and then you send out the little bits in their own journal article. Not giving anybody the total set of findings, but giving everybody a smaller set to increase your potential of having lots of things published. So if those are pretty cut and dried and we can have a list, then what makes ethics tricky? And, Adrian's asking, does falsification exaggerate fabrication or misinforms? Yes, it misinforms. I would say it's more than an exaggeration of fabrication, though. It exaggerates the effects. It's an exaggerated effect of misinformation because it's based on nothing, where fabrication was based on something, just helped out a little bit. So falsification is a much more drastic, more than an exaggeration. It's more a wholly different thing, both with the intent, and that's the thing, intent to misinform for your own benefit. What makes ethics tricky? Well, time is the big one. Our cultural understanding of life has changed. Science is changing. So let's look at these. In 1950s, animals were not considered. Now, with 2050, 100 years later, the way animals are going and the way animal rights are going and the way we are now understanding animals in science, whether or not, which animals we can test, because which ones are considered actual beings, because they have that level of intelligence, that's changing around us. Experiments on people in care. Used to be that, a group of people all locked up together, that was a perfect place to have a set of experiments. And now, of course, we know that there's protected status for children and prisoners because they were over-experimented on. And then who's going to be next as the protected status? Anything goes if the person agrees to sign off on it. Used to be the way it was done, if a person could give me a signature, and they gave signatures because they were given financial incentives, all kinds of things. So now we aren't allowed to give money to get somebody to sign their rights away. And we have questions such as, should we have experiments that mess with somebody's DNA? Should we allow for crossbreeding of species as research? So we're facing, as our world grows, we're facing some pretty dicey ethical issues. Conflicts of interest between business and research didn't used to be particularly considered. Now it is not allowed to have a conflict of interest, and you have to make sure that every potential conflict of interest is unpacked. That would hold true when the researcher was part of the organization, etc. Other questions that are coming into our ethical understanding include embryo mapping, brain cell manipulation, putting chips in people and tracking them around, doing things to other forms of life. We have to look at these very carefully. And then in the 1950s and really up until today, you would say that salami slicing was pretty common. And now it's a cause for withdrawal of your research. So times are changing, our understanding is changing, and where we put ourselves in the ethical world. So that's a quick overview. I want to go into, Miriam, glad you could join us. You probably didn't miss very much, but if you did, it'll be in the recording. The practicalities of designing and proving ethics. All right. So what is ethical review? First off, who are your ethical reviewers? An institution, when it is given certification to grant a graduate degree, part of that degree, part of that submission process is a discussion of who are on their internal review board and how those internal review board rules and regs were set up and what that documentation looks like. And all the people on the internal review go through a training about what they're required to do before they can sit on an IRB board. And I'm speaking now from my previous experience in the United States because I was on several of these, but I'm pretty sure it's similar in Europe too. If any of the people in the room come from Europe and you know of any differences, please let me know. So, but you have a group of people, say 5 or 6. They meet every so often, depending on the number of papers that will be turned in. Generally, a student has a form to fill out, and they fill it out and they turn it in. It goes to the review board. After the review board meets, they're told whether or not they pass. It has been my experience that students don't take these forms seriously enough, especially in the U.S., where you might have just gone through a very intensive defensive 3-chapter proposal. Seems like a very big deal. You can make the mistake to think that your ethical review papers aren't such a big deal. And that is a mistake, because I have seen students held up one as long as 1.5 years before he was allowed to go on and complete his research. And the reason for that is because their job is different than the job of the people who are looking at your work through a proposal defense or whatever other kind of prospectus hearing your university requires. These people, the ethical review people, are all about protection. They, to some extent, want to protect the institution from bad research, but hopefully the prior steps you've gone through would have done that. But these people care about protecting the public, and protecting the public from things as small, relatively small, as wasting their time. So you don't get to ask questions that are outside of what you really need to have answered in order to answer your research questions, that kind of thing. So they look very carefully at the way the study is designed and how they can protect the people that are involved, how they can protect against errors that could lead to a situation where you would be tempted to falsify or fabricate. They also want to protect the values such as trust, accountability, mutual respect, and fairness. And Adrian is bringing up these things happen. She's telling a story about a fellow of hers who's analyzing her data and still hasn't passed her IRB. You know, if anyone knew about that, her data would be thrown out. It's just not allowed. And these kinds of things, to say they don't happen is a mistake, but they shouldn't happen. And there will be people on board at your university to ensure they don't happen. That's an unfortunate story. Practicality. So what is ethical review to you? Well, it's your test of not having a biased point of view. It's your test that you don't ask questions that don't relate to your problem or research questions directly. It's your test that you're not really even have a chance to manipulate questions or later data because of the way you've set it up is so clean and so obvious, and they can see how one thing relates to another. It's your way of showing people how you're going to do your informed consent. And if you haven't had a chance to just practice informed consent, and you are doing interviews, or for that matter, surveys that you're passing out to people, practice it. Get it smooth so that they don't feel uncomfortable. I have had experience with my subjects when I do human studies research where they get uncomfortable with the informed consent piece. It's like, oh, yeah, just let me sign. So you want to be able to say, you know, it's important to us that you're treated well, and that the benefits of what you're doing are going to be this, and the risks of what you're doing are going to be this, and I'm going to protect you and your data in this way. If you ever feel later on like, gee, you wish you had said something or you want to drop out, just let me know, or this other person, and there will be no harm that comes from that. And all your data will be held in confidence unless I come back to you and ask you for permission to use your name or something. So however your informed consent runs, that's its basic, those are its basic tenets, and just get really comfortable with them. You also want to protect them from the fact that there is not going to be harm even if they choose not to participate. So they might have told you 6 months, a year, 2 years ago that they wanted to be part of your research. They might be your friend, and when it comes right down to it, they might not really want to do this. So you have to do it in such a way that they can feel comfortable saying, you know, I don't really want to do this anymore. Disappointing to you, but that's what makes it ethical. No undue influence from the research participants. So a big one here is if you work in the organization that you're taking your human studies research data from, that you aren't anybody's boss, or that somehow that's protected, that they don't know it's you, or other ways of doing that. But this idea of undue influence is quite big, especially in qualitative studies. But in quantitative studies too, we don't want data from people who are giving us the answer that they think we want to hear. Doesn't do us any good, doesn't do our research any good. And that leads me into the fact that neutrality is key. That goes back to the beginning of unbiased point of view. So your ethical review board may question whether or not your questions have any bias, or the way you ask them has any bias, or whether there's any part of the way this is set up where there will be influence that shouldn't be there. And Adrian suggests that doctoral students may be asked or could volunteer to be part of one another's IRB. It's good, it would be interesting to do so, because if you get a chance to sit in on a review board discussion, they talk about things you would not, their format is different. This is another view of how we set up research. It's an important view, and it's one worth having an insider experience on if you get a chance. So here's the thing that I think is subtle for some people. These things, your problem statement, the contribution you hope to make, your problem statement as in what's wrong and needs to be fixed, your problem situation, that's the context of your problem, who's involved, why, how big that population is, whether or not your sample is of a large enough size to really be a reliable sample in that problem situation of that problem, and then how you drill down to a specific topic. Those things, of course, need to come together for your first 3 chapters, for your research design, etc. But they also need to come together for your ethics. So let's think about that. You have a problem situation, so you have a context. Say you're studying something in a neighborhood. Within that context, you're asking questions that could have some effect on the people. So the way you choose your subjects has an ethical concern. The topic may have some ethical concerns to it, and how measurable it is within that local context, whether it can be studied by those people. All of these are getting the review board to the question of, are you asking the right questions, to whom, of whom, in what context, in order to ethically get your questions answered without doing harm to the people who are being asked. So it's subtle, and it has a bit of conversation to it that you might not have otherwise considered. So making it all match up. This is a particularly useful tool. It comes from a university that I used to work for, and I have seen people rise and fall on their ethical review as to whether or not they could fill out this form well. So your research questions go in the first column, and then how you're going to ask those questions, your data collection tools, whether or not it's an instrument or it's an interview. If it's an interview, what are the questions of that interview? And all of those. So first column maybe just a question. Second column has quite a bit of things in it. And then it gets even longer when you look at the data points that will yield from these tools. So if you're doing an instrumentation survey, then your data points can be comparative between one subpopulation that you've disaggregated from another. They can be scales of variables, all kinds of things. So you list your data points, the specific probes. If you're doing interviews or qualitative work, the questions would come in one, and then the probes would come in the other. So, and then you tie it back to your sample. Who are going to be able to answer these questions? What are the demographics of that population? How are you going to get to them? How are the records going to be held? And then what outcome do you expect to get through statistical analysis or qualitative analysis, so that I can be able to go back to the research question in a loop and make sure I can get there. And this particular form, if really well filled out, will help you see the parts that don't line up well. So I hope it's useful. Questions before just a couple things to wrap them up. All of it making great sense, you're ready to just go off and do it? Or when you think about your study in this way, are there any questions? Now, Adrian, your study is archival, so you're probably IRB exempt. It used to be that teachers were exempt if they were studying their own populations of students, that kind of waivers, I've seen it not be true, even though I looked it up and it's still on the books as an exemption, in the United States anyway. So if you're doing anything that's archival, you don't actually have to talk to people you're in. Basically, then it's filling out a form. Any questions in the room? If no one raises their hand, I will go on. Just zipping through today's. Okay, looking up the IRB form. Probably you will, you'll get to be able to say you're exempt. You have to send in the form anyway, but it's a sign off. They just go through those at the beginning, and actually a clerk usually does them, looks at the justification for exemption and says, oh yeah, this is natural, this is natural. TC is Teachers College, Saluhu. It's where she goes to school. Okay, so remember when you look at these forms that specificity is your friend. I cannot tell you how many students lost months because they turned in a form that was lightly done, only to have the review board send it back because they had questions. And if you have to wait a month before the review to actually take place, or 6 weeks, and then you have to wait another 6 weeks for it to go in again, that is just an irritant at a time when you're ready to start your work. So be specific. Look at it from this kind of, look to see whether things loop back. Look to see whether or not you've created linkages through these different questions that the ethical review really needs to get to. Have you convinced them that your questions lead to all the outcomes that you need? Okay, so I think the table aligns the different components too. It was probably the best tool that I've come across, and it's one I recommend everybody use, whether your school requires anything like it or not. The forms you fill out could have been designed 15 years ago, and they could be not adequate to the task at hand too. So as I said, specificity is your friend. Bury them with clear, concise detail, rather than let them come back to you with questions. Okay, so what have you heard? Have you heard about any troubles? Are you curious about anything? Adrienne was curious about her friend who's crunching data. I think that's not a good story. But anything else? And if not, I'll move on. We'll have a short session today. Good. Okay. And the slides, Saluhu, I will be, as soon as I finish talking here, I'll put the slides up on SlideShare, and I'll come back here and give you the link so that you can have them available. One last slide, then we'll close off the recording. What's happening at, Amanda asked a good question before I go here. What is the typical turnaround for a proposal that meets all the IRB requirements? So it instantaneously. What you have to do, it depends on how often the time issue here is how often your IRB committee meets. So go to the IRB, whatever office it is in your university, ask when they meet, when is the next meeting date, and make sure, and how far ahead of that date do you have to have your forms in to be considered. So it's quite possible that if the meeting is on May 1st, you can't drop your forms on May 1st and have it be considered. It's quite possible they need a week or 2 weeks of staff time before they go into the committee. So find out when the committee meets, when you need to have your forms in, and then plan your timing accordingly. If you get it in 2 days after the last meeting and they don't meet except once every 6 weeks, your typical turnaround time, even if you pass flying colors, will be 6 weeks. Make sense, Amanda? That's the key issue. Chelsea, hi. No worries that you came a little late. This is being recorded, and you'll have it all there. Miriam, you too. I think I said hi. All right. What's up? Happening with the DoctoralNet portals. However you sign into your DoctoralNet, your university.doctoralnet, or if you're an individual client and you just come to doctoralnet.com, we recommend that right now you scan all the webinars for this quarter. We're finding that some of the spaces are filling up quite tight. We don't have an unlimited number of spaces, and even though you might see a dozen of people in the room, there might have been 75 who signed up, and we have a number of spaces for 100. So if you like the webinars, sign up early. May 2016 is a time when we recommend you plan ahead for summer. Summer, huge issue in doctoral land. Many, like I would say a majority of students would come at the end of summer and say, I didn't get as much done as I'd intended. And that's just a shame. It has to do with planning and time management, things that you have complete control over. So step number 1, backwards map your summer. Include in the backwards map all the family obligations you have, etc., so that you have a good summer, but you get your work done too. If you don't know about backwards mapping, go to your control panel on a DoctoralNet website under resources. Well, I would say actually probably the fastest thing to do is to go to either time management in the middle column or to the search under your account. There's a search on the upper right-hand corner and type in backwards map. Remember to block out your time, especially important on summer when you're looking at your week ahead. Block the hours that you're strongest mentally and give those hours to your thesis or dissertation. And the center control panel, in the control panel, in the center section, pull down menu, look at planning and time management. There are lots of hints there. Good things to remember. Turn off your distractions. You don't need Facebook Messenger. You don't need your phone beeping, all of those things while you're writing, because you are mentally or reading, or for that matter, doing anything on your thesis, crunching data, because you are mentally wired to pay more attention to the distraction than it is worth. So just make sure you don't get any. And if you need a particular kind of help, you're stuck on anything that's too fast ways to get it, to sign up to Skype on DoctoralNet, and you'll get help within 24 hours, or email Margie@doctoralnet.com, and she will, oh, thank you for mentioning, Amanda, that it's 2017, May 2016. I was a year off. Email Margie. She will give you specifics. And I'll clean up the slides before I put them in up on SlideShare. Thank you, Amanda. Anything else? We good to go 20 minutes early today? If you have questions about any part of your thesis or dissertation, now's the time to ask. While I get this slide cleaned up, I'll give you a minute to type. I'm going to turn off the recording for those that were watching by recording. I hope you found this helpful. As I said, not the